To welcome you back to the second session here, and we will begin with Professor Lan Pei-chia, who is Professor of Sociology at National Taiwan University. She was a visiting scholar at Harvard-yenching and also at the Radcliffe Institute last year, and her book entitled Global Cinderellas, Migrant Domestics and Newly Rich Employers in Taiwan, won a 2007 Distinguished Book Award for the best study in social science from the International Convention of Asian Scholars. Professor Lan has published widely on questions of gender, work, migration across East Asia, especially Taiwan-Shanghai connections. And currently, she's working on a book manuscript that deals with parenting, globalization, and class inequality. So, Professor Lan.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Professor Perry and the Harvard-yenching Institute for inviting me here and coordinating this wonderful event. Today, I will be talking about convergence and divergence of immigration policy in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. What can we learn from looking at immigration policy? We migration scholars use the term migration regime to describe a multitude of state regulations that promote or discourage the entry and employment of migrants. Basically, the policy regime defines what constitutes us by excluding them. The politics of belonging and identity demonstrate various ways of negotiating ethnic boundaries and different coupling relationship between the state and the civil society, as we are going to see in these three empirical cases. These three countries share similar demographics, including low proportion of foreigners, relative ethnic homogeneity, and ethno-national identities. These three countries also face similar emerging problems and challenges in recent years. First, labor shortage in 3D jobs the locals are not interested in. And in correspondence, there has been rising number of undocumented migrant workers to fill the labor shortage. Secondly, all the three countries have a rapidly aging population coupled with a declining birth rate. As you can see the number here, very striking. The aging population has brought about a declining labor supply and increasing demand on care. And thirdly, bride deficits. Gender asymmetry in the population has contributed to the demand for potential brides. The skewed sex ratio, especially striking in Taiwan and South Korea, is partly a result of prenatal sex selection used by some parents to meet the traditional preference for some. Another reason that contributes to the problem of bride deficits is the rising population of single women. The proportion is very high in Japan and Taiwan. The number are even higher among the women with a university degree or higher. The gender gap in educational achievement and the persisting culture of hypergamy have limited women's choices in mating. In Taiwan, the proportion of college-educated women has outnumbered the same ratio in men. Lower-educated men fall into disfavor in the local marriage market and developed an increased tendency to seek brides overseas. So facing these emerging problems and challenges, this three countries has turned to the recruitment of foreign workers and foreign brides as potential solution. In Taiwan, as you can see in the chart, Taiwan started a guest worker program in 1992 to recruit foreigners to fill the labor shortage while maintaining the status of migrant workers as temporary and disposable. You can see in the chart that the number of migrant workers has continued to grow, especially the yellow line that describes domestic and care workers working in private households. All migrant workers are employed on a contract basis. The maximum duration for their work permit was initially 3 years and has gradually extended to 9 years for now. Taiwan has received a big inflows of foreign brides. Most of them are from mainland China and Southeast Asia. In the peak year of 2003, 28% of the total number of registered marriage was composed of unions between Taiwanese groom and foreign brides. The proportion dropped after 2004. After the government changed the process of interview and visa application to discourage cross-border marriages. Let's look at Japan. Japan's condition is somewhat different because it has maintained a closed-door policy to skilled migrant workers. So when you look at the statistics of foreigners in Japan, it seems that all the foreign workers are skilled professional migrants plus entertainers from the Philippines. However, there has been a side door or back door, that is the trainee system Japan has adopted since 1993. And the trainees are mostly from China and Southeast Asia. Let's see, and also Japan has received a growing number of foreign brides, mostly from China and also from the Philippines. Many of these Filipinas first came to a country as entertainers and got married to Japanese men. So how about South Korea? When you look at the number of foreign workers in Korea, you could actually see a clear influence from its neighboring countries. Korea has adopted a trainee system similar to Japan's in 1994. So the number of workers with employment visa was very low. However, the number of trainees were high, and also the number of overstayers, undocumented migrants. And then South Korea adopted a guest worker system similar to Taiwan in 2004. So I'm going to get into more details later. And South Korea also received a growing number of marriage migrants. Most of them are from the Philippines, Vietnam, and China. These are mostly ethnic Korean Chinese. The South Korean government has actually actively promoted cross-border marriage as a solution to the bride deficit in the countryside. Local governments and assemblies actively arrange marriage meetings between local farmers and Korean Chinese women. In addition, the Unification Church has played an intermediate role in recruiting Filipina wives. So what I'm arguing that there has been some degree of a convergence in terms of immigration policy among these three countries. The first regarding the recruitment of labor migrants. South Korea has introduced a system called EPS, Employment Permit System, in 2004. It replaced the trainee system after 2007. EPS workers is employed on a contract basis, and the maximum residence for them right now is 5 years. And also Japan's, although it still somewhat maintains a closed-door policy regarding unskilled migrants, but Japan has started to recruit care workers and nurses based on economic partnership agreements, EPA, signed with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand and Vietnam. So the EPA workers including two categories, nursing candidates and certified care workers candidates. So how did this policy convergence happen? Indeed, the government official in these countries has learned from the success and failure of their neighboring country. Oftentimes through government-sponsored academic research programs. Personally, I was invited to attend quite a few workshops in Japan and South Korea before the government adopted guest worker system and EPA employment. But at the same time, I also emphasize that this policy transformation happened due to bottom-up activism and transnational network. For example, undocumented migrant workers in South Korea, working with local NGOs and local unions, define themselves as both victims to employer exploitation and human beings entitled to universal labor rights. And the second line of convergence happens around the issue of campaign of multiculturalism. These are the posters of Taiwanese local governments to emphasize they have done quite a few service to help with marriage migrants. Taiwan's Immigration Bureau was established in 2007, and there has been a generous fund in service foreign spouses starting from 2005. Korea has passed the Basic Act on the Treatment of Foreigners in 2007, and Japan, there has been a campaign called Multicultural Coexistence Promotion in Local Communities starting from 2005. Again, I want to emphasize that these top-down policy measures happen to respond to partly to respond to the political empowerment of marriage migrants. And their voices are more forceful than migrant workers because most of these marriage migrants will eventually become citizens and bear the next generation of citizens. However, I also want to emphasize that there has been substantial divergence among the immigration policy of these three countries. First, regarding the negotiation of ethnic boundaries. Taiwan's government has maintained a closed-door policy to Chinese workers, with the exception of Chinese fishermen who are nevertheless not allowed to be on board. There were also discriminatory rules for Chinese brides until recently, including quota control for their entry and a longer year of residency required for naturalization. The government prefers Southeast Asian because their difference from Taiwanese in terms of culture, language, and physical features are assumed to be more evident. By contrast, exactly because Chinese migrants are too assimilatable, too easy to become part of us, the distrust of them as hidden political threat is exacerbated. The situation is very different in South Korea and China. Korea has welcomed the working visit of Joseon-jok, ethnic Korean Chinese, first through a program of EMS since 2002, and later it was incorporated into the EPS system in the category of H2 visa. Ethnic Korean Chinese are given preferential access to higher paying jobs such as service and construction. At the same time, Korean Chinese women are also encouraged to marry Korean men because they are supposedly represent a lesser threat to the blood purity of Korean identity. So this is the current number of migrant workers in South Korea. So you can see that the working visits of ethnic Korean Chinese still occupies the largest share of migrant workers nowadays. In Japan, similarly, Japan revised the immigration law in 1989 to create a visa category of long-term residents to accommodate the employment of non-citizens of Japanese descent from Brazil and Peru. In a 2010 government survey, the Japanese respondents consider the most important qualification for foreign workers as Japanese language skill, understanding Japanese custom and culture, while professional skill and knowledge was considered with less priority. So following this logic, the curriculum for EPA workers is also designed based on the belief that linguistic skill and cultural knowledge are essential in the provision of quality care for Japanese elders. An EPA candidate must attend a half-year intensive course on Japanese language and culture. The second point of divergence I want to emphasize here is the different incorporation patterns among these three countries. in this chart, you can see that when compare the components of registered foreign resident in Japan and Korea, you see there's a large proportion of permanent resident in Japan. Most of them are Koreans. On the other hand, in Korea, most of these registered foreigners are guest workers and ethnic Korean, whose status in Korea is still temporary. So in Japan's case, it's basically based on the model of permanent residency. Even in the case of EPA program, Japanese government has made clear that they wanted to recruit skilled foreigners who are expected to continue employment and residency in Japan after passing the national exams to become registered nurses or certified care workers. However, because the language bar has been so high, very few EPA candidates have successfully passed the exam. In South Korea, the program is based on guest workers. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more point I want to emphasize in Japan's case. In Japan, the campaign of multiculturalism has taken place mostly at the level of local communities. Because according to Aaron Chung, in Japan, grassroots movement led by generation of Koreans from the 1960s set the foundation for decentralized, community-based strategies for incorporating new immigrants, especially marriage migrants. So let's look at Korea's case now. It's modeled based on guest workers. However, the regulation is very centralized. The recruitment of EPS workers, including matching, job placement, pre-departure, and post-arrival orientation, are all managed by government agency. Even the recruitment for foreign brides is mediated by local governments. Migrant workers in Korea has made significant success in gaining rights, largely because of the strong tradition of labor movements in Korea's democratization movement and due to the alliance between local unions and migrant workers. By contrast, in Taiwan, it also a guest worker program, but the recruitment of both guest worker and marriage migrants is dominated by commercial broker. A migrant worker has to pay up to 5 to 9 months of agency fee. Social activism to protect migrant workers' rights has not been as successful as Korea because Taiwan's labor movement is much weaker and local unions have not been sympathetic to migrant workers. So let me just conclude briefly. I have shown you convergence as well as divergence in East Asian immigration policy. The convergence happens because these three countries face similar demographics, common challenges, and reciprocal influences. However, substantial divergence still exists due to particular social dynamics and historical past dependence in these three individual countries. Thank you.